Welcome to Food Friends, a podcast inspiring home cooks to try new dishes in the kitchen by sharing trusted recipes, tips, and friendship. Hi, I'm Sonia.
And I'm Carrie. We met in Los Angeles over 15 years ago as personal chefs and haven't stopped talking about food since. We're so glad you're here. Hi, Sonia.
Hi, Carrie.
Sonia, I'm excited to get into braises today.
Yeah, one of our listeners actually reached out and asked us if we could do an episode on braises. And it was sort of already on our minds, wasn't it? Because it's that
Yeah,
time of year.
it's that time of year, and this is a great way to take cheaper cuts of meat or also beans and vegetables. There's all kinds of ways you can braise things long. We can braise quickly, we can braise for hours. So I'd love to, we have a few recipes that we're bringing to this space. So,
Yeah, I
um,
think it might be helpful to just give some tips on some basics of braising and sort of define it. So, a braise is typically something that's cooked in some kind of liquid, a simmered liquid. It is typically considered a low and slow cooking process. And that's because there's the chemistry and the science behind how the proteins break down or even the vegetable breaks down at a lower heat over a prolonged period of time versus something that's aggressively hot. And you can think about things even when you cook something at a vigorous boil, it is different than when you slowly, ever so slowly, gently cook something.
yeah, or even something that cooks at like a really high heat quickly, like on your grill. You have a great New York strip or a filet mignon, you cook that on the grill. But we're really talking about, in terms of meat, a piece of meat that has more connective tissue. So it needs more time for that tissue to kind of melt. And, really braising really usually means something that's like kind of falling off the bone or and very tender, a tender brisket, a tender short rib, even things like chicken, it's cooked. Chicken will be cooked in 30-ish minutes. But if you give it that extra 15, 20, 25 minutes, it really kind of melts off the bone.
Yeah, and if you're cooking it in liquid, and I think that is the distinction. So yes, you could cook low and slow without liquid, like a that would be its own process. But braising is really that steam, that infusion of flavor. And so I guess like a couple things to just start with. A lot of people often have questions about what temperature they should be braising at, and I used to always be kind of a 350 person. But I've realized as I became, when I had a restaurant, as I learned more from other cooks around me, that really 325, even 300, even 275 is actually better for a braise. It means it will take a little longer than if you're braising at 350, but it usually yields more tenderness and softness.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm definitely more in the 275 range. When I was growing up, I feel like almost every recipe my mom made was like bake at 350. And I'm kind of like when I'm roasting things, I'm always in the 400, 450 range. But when I'm braising, I really knock it down to like the 300, 275, even 250. And it does take longer, but that slower temperature, that longer amount of time really yields the results that you're looking for when you're braising things.
Which is something tender. And this is the other point is people often have questions about the timing. So I think like with braising, with all cooking, it's important not just to follow a recipe. It's important to use your own instincts because every oven is different. Every cut of meat is different. Some briskets are fattier and more tender. Some are really tougher. So even if a recipe says braise for 3 hours at 300 degrees, you need to be checking that. So usually people tend to under braise. They tend to not braise for long enough, resulting in sort of like a tougher cut of meat, chewier. And then, but it is possible to braise for too long. So what I try to do is like half an hour before the end of my braising time, suggested braising time, I start checking and I check with like a paring knife or a fork or something where I can really get into the meat and see if it's starting to yield like so soft and tender. You just know if it's bouncing back at all, if there's any give, it needs longer. And then the over braising is really if you're going it's that's so much harder to do. That happens so much more rarely. But if you've gone for like 5 hours or something, sometimes what happens is like even though there's liquid, the meat starts tasting dry. It can dry out. It's counterintuitive.
Yeah, I think this is such a critical tip that you're offering of really following your instincts. And yes, the when you're looking at a recipe, it's giving you a range of timing, but like once you kind of get in that range of when they say it's going to be done, really use your own instincts and, get a little paring knife and a fork in there and if there's any bounce back, then keep going a little bit further and check, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, like keep checking back in on it. And really, you're supposed to yield like a very tender piece of meat.
Yes, it feels like it takes no effort to cut through, and it starts if there's a bone, it will be falling off the bone, and you know it's done. And you can also reheat it, and I don't usually think that reheating actually results in dryness unless you're going for hours, but we can get more
Or
into
doing
that.
it too much, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But usually a braise the other thing I would say is I almost always make braises a day ahead of time or 2 days ahead of time because they always taste better and even more tender reheated for whatever reason.
I agree. Well, I think when you what we're talking about is a flavorful liquid, and so you're cooking. Generally, what you're cooking is a piece of meat in this flavorful liquid. You get it to this tender place. You let it cool. It's in the liquid. You put it in the fridge in the liquid, and then a day later, all that flavor has had a chance to marry together, and then you reheat it gently. It's really the flavors are so much better the next day or even 2 days later.
And we'll give some tips on like specific recipes and what to do. But yes, as a general rule, I'd also just briefly like to add about the vessels that people cook in. I love Dutch ovens for braising because they're heavy bottom. They hold heat really evenly and well. And you kind of want that, but they're not essential. So if you don't have a Le Creuset or a fancy enamel Dutch oven at home, you don't need one. In the restaurant, we used what are called hotel pans, which are stainless steel deep dish pans which is essentially like a big casserole dish. You can use a Pyrex. You could use a hotel pan. You could invest in a hotel pan from a restaurant supply store, and that will be cheaper than a Le Creuset. You can use a heavy pot, like even a soup pot that you can cover, or a roasting pan that's deep. Basically, you want something where liquid can go into it and your meat can sit in an even layer. And that even layer is very important. So you're never wanting to stack one part of a brisket on top of another brisket. You want things big enough that they can hold everything in one layer, or you want two separate vessels to cook in. And then the last thing that I learned particularly in catering and having a restaurant, is you want to really create a seal. So the thing about a Dutch oven is it has that great lid, but even with a Dutch oven, I put a layer of parchment over my braise and
You
then put a
do.
lid on. And if you don't have a lid to your vessel, you do a layer of parchment and then you do foil on top. That's what we did at the restaurant. And that there's something about the parchment and basically every chef I know has shared this with me. This is what they do. It creates it locks in the steam and the moisture even more and it keeps that top from drying out and somehow it creates even more infusion of the flavor. I wish I understood the science better. I just know it makes a difference.
Well, I'm so glad to know that because I generally try to cook in my Le Creuset, my enameled Dutch ovens. I do also have like a cast iron, just straight up cast iron that has a lid on it, but I always find that it doesn't seal so well, and that's always my concern when I'm braising something in a like a Pyrex or a casserole dish is like how to really get that seal going. And I feel like tinfoil is like a little bit loose, and so this idea, I don't know how I've missed this tip that a piece of parchment paper kind of solves all of that. But I think that's the other thing too is like, you know, braising is such a universal technique in every culture. And so you don't need fancy equipment to do this. You don't need like a $300 pot to do this.
No, you don't. And also, you can braise on your stovetop. That should also be noticed. That should also be noted. We talked a little bit about all the things we use in the oven and the temperature in the oven, but a couple of the recipes that we're going to talk about today, you can make on a stovetop basically with any kind of pot or deep pan that has a lid. And you could also use foil. I think with foil, you can get a tight seal, but I just think that parchment adds that extra layer that's so good. So yeah, it's kind of now automatic that I add it.
Well, I really love that tip, and I'm gonna start using that. I know that in your cookbook, you have this incredible brisket recipe, so I'm hoping that's where we can start today, is that you kind of share with everyone this incredible brisket recipe that you have, because I think that's I mean, at least for me, that's generally where my mind goes to, is like a piece of red meat, like a brisket or a short rib that people like to braise.
Yeah, brisket is such a classic Jewish food. And I found that a lot of briskets that I ate out at other Jewish establishments, like restaurants or catering gigs or, like bar and bat mitzvahs, they're often very sweet. There's this like tradition of braising in Coca Cola. And
Really?
yes, that's like a super common brisket dish. And there's also a tradition of using like a French onion soup mix as part of the braising
I've
flavoring.
definitely heard that one.
So actually didn't eat brisket in my home. It wasn't part of our like sort of Soviet background and repertoire. That wasn't a dish from there. So I started making brisket in my early 20s when I started hosting Rosh Hashanah or Pesach, Passover. That's when I started to learn how to teach myself. And I really learned from this really good Tyler Florence recipe. Tyler Florence is this chef who used to have a show on Food Network. And coincidentally, I actually ended up working with his culinary producer, the woman who like helped him develop all his recipes. She became a mentor in my life. But before that ever happened, I was using this recipe, and the one in my book is really adapted from that. So I'll share Tyler Florence's. If you want my personal recipe, you can grab a copy of my book. And then I also just want to add that I think brisket is a great way to make friends and maybe even romance someone because Jonathan, very early on, he claims that I, like, seduced him because I had this Super Bowl party. We'd only been dating a month, and I don't even like football. I don't know why. And partly it was 'cause my hometown team was in the Super Bowl, and my brother was there, and anyway, otherwise I never would have thrown a Super Bowl party, but I decided to make, like, an onion beer braised brisket for that particular event. I'll link a recipe for that too. And he just thinks like it was a spell I cast.
He was wooed by your brisket. I love that so much. I mean, that's I think that's the crux of what this kind of cooking method yields, is like it's such comfort and connection and care. And there's something about like, a dish like this that's been cooking in your oven for hours and hours on end. It's like perfumes your whole house. And
Right.
and even though we're talking about, like, I imagine that you made this brisket the day before, but then the next day you're reheating it and it's just like infusing all that smell into your house again. And people walk in and they're like, "Oh wow, what is that?" Like, it almost smells grandmotherly in that
Oh,
way too?
totally. It's such home comfort food. So just to give a few pointers on brisket, I like to get brisket with fat still on it. You want to get either the point end or the other end. If you get those giant briskets all together and you cook them all at once, they cook at different rates. So you basically want like a consistent thickness across your brisket. I trim excess fat, but I keep some on top because I think that infuses the braising liquid too. Not everyone likes that. If you don't like a lot of fat, then get the brisket with the fat trimmed, or you can ask your butcher to do it for you. I really like the briskets at Costco too. That's my other tip. I usually divide those in half because, again, you want the two separate pieces to cook evenly. Then for me, like I said, I like savory brisket. I'm not looking for a sweet braising liquids. So typically what I'm doing is onion, carrot, celery, and wine or beer, and garlic, parsley, thyme, whatever aromatics or spices or herbs you like, but you can keep it pretty simple. And the process for every brisket is the same. You take that meat, you let it come to room temperature. Coming to room temperature is very important for every braise, whether it's beef, lamb, or chicken. You season it heavily with salt and pepper. I usually do that and then let it come to temp so the salt and pepper can kind of penetrate as it's sitting there. And then I get whatever cooking vessel is big enough or whatever I'm going to braise it in onto the stovetop, super hot, and I sear it on all sides. I get a really browned crust. That is also going to add tons of flavor. It's going to lock in moisture. It just is a really important step and adds dimension to your braise. Then you take that piece of meat out of the pan, you let it rest, and you throw your onions, carrots, and celery into those brown bits on the bottom of your pan. I like to do big chunks. This is not a time for fine chopping. You can cut things in thirds and halves. You don't need it. That's why it's actually kind of quick to me as a dish.
Right.
It's not that hard. And then
It's
you're
not fussy, you're not spending, like, 15 minutes chopping
no.
all the stuff, you're just kind of, like, getting through it and moving
So
forward.
exactly, and you're really, like, using the drippings, like, I don't drain the pan unless it's a crazy amount of fat, otherwise, I leave a layer of oil on the bottom from the brisket itself. Get that brown, add tomato paste. I think tomato paste is a key ingredient. It adds the umami, it adds the caramelization, and then you nestle that meat back in. You can add your herbs, your bay leaf, whatever you're using, peppercorns, and then you add your liquid. For me, that's usually a mix of wine and stock, but water works if you don't have stock, or beer, like just straight beer. Beer and stock is also a good mix. I think cutting the alcohol with stock just makes it less alcohol forward. It's the alcohol will cook off, but it kind of mellows that flavor. Like if you use pure wine, it's a little intense. And then you cover that tightly. You want the liquid to come up at least almost to the top of the meat, at least three quarters. Cover it tightly and you let it cook until it's tender.
And let me ask you this, after your meat is tender, then you take your meat out of that braising liquid, and then do you strain your liquid? Do you refrigerate it separately to take the fat off? Because that's actually something I like to do. I like to keep as much fat on that meat as I possibly can, knowing that I can skim off excess later on, because I think that's also what people don't remember about a dish like this, a braising dish, is that there's so much room for fixing things as you go, right?
Yes, and exactly to your point, I think the chef step, the restaurant step is to strain it, and if I'm feeling like that's what I wanna do, I strain it. If not, I just throw it all in, I let it cool and then I put it in the fridge, and then I skim off the fat the next day solidifies. If you don't strain it, it just makes it harder to scoop it off because there's, like, vegetable and herb pieces, but
Right?
it's not impossible, and the next day before I reheat it, I slice it. I slice it
When
cold
it's
because it's
cold, because it
so
slices,
much
yeah.
easier. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense. The meat doesn't tear as much when it's cold, right? It doesn't
Yeah,
shred while you're trying to cut it when it's warm. It really kind of really falls apart, but when it's cold, it really holds its shape better. So you get those really nice, like a beautiful presentation. You don't need that, for if it's not that fancy of a dinner, but it's also kind of nice to present it in a beautiful way.
and it saves you time because you slice it
Yes.
cold, you put it back into its liquid, you put it back into whatever dish you're gonna heat it up in, and then you heat it up. And so you just basically have it all ready to go for your guests. I also find reheating it in a crock pot works really well and keeps it from drying out. I love reheating brisket in a crock pot, and then it keeps it warm and just ready to serve when you're ready. And then the last thing I'll say is at a restaurant, you strain that liquid and then you make a pan sauce with it before you serve it. So you'll heat it maybe in its liquid, but then you'll take the braise out and you'll put that liquid in a pan, and people typically add butter, which is not kosher. So if you don't mix milk and dairy, you could also use non-dairy butter, and you whisk it in, and then you have this like kind of fatty, glossy, rich jus that you can pour over your brisket. That's another sort of like next level tip, but that is not what I do at home.
You keep it simple at
Keep
home.
it simple because that
Yeah.
liquid is so delicious. The brisket itself is so flavorful. I've done enough. I don't feel like doing the extra step usually.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've done in the past too is take all that liquid out and refrigerate it, skim off, a good amount of fat. I still leave some of it in there. And then there are times when I've also taken that and put it in the food processor to make a thicker sauce. And if
Oh.
it depending on how many vegetables are in there, you can always add a little bit more broth to that and thin it out if you don't want it to be so thick. But it's like it's almost like a creamier sauce than like a brothy sauce, basically.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love that tip. Carrie, do you have like a Midwestern version of what brisket is to me?
Well, it's funny. I actually have a Louisiana
Okay.
version that my friend taught me, and I will say, like, I definitely grew up with a lot of braises, like a pot roast. My dad cooks ham, but our the tradition in my family was never to brown any meat. So
Interesting.
learning how to brown the meat itself, I think that's a critical piece of like the most delicious version of a braise. But it really, you can still just like throw a big roast in a pot, like add some onions and cover it and cook it, and it will yield like a tender piece of meat. It's just that browning process develops so much more flavor. So a few years ago, my friend Roxanne taught me how to make these Cajun pork chops. And it's really, there's a couple of like critical tips, but basically, what it is a bone in pork chop that you really brown well, and you add some onions to that. You add some onions to it at some point. You add water or broth, and then you braise it until it's falling off the bone. It yields this really rich, savory gravy, and then you serve it over like a very like small bed of rice so that it's mostly pork chop and gravy, and then the rice kind of like helps you scoop the gravy with the pork chop. So it's not like a big pile of rice.
What is this dish called? Like smothered pork chops? Is that what people call it?
Well, their family calls it Cajun pork chops, but yeah, I
Uh-huh.
think you can call it like a smothered pork chop. It's also, you could do this with chicken as well and also with beef. But the first most important tip is that she uses bone-in pork chops that are very, very thin. Like ask your
Oh.
butcher to cut them like really, really thin. And it depends on how many I'm cooking, but basically what I do is I have a cast iron Dutch oven, and so I will put like two, three, four of these pork chops in the cast iron at once. And I this is the kind of dish that you really also want to use like a neutral oil, like a canola oil or an avocado oil or something that has a higher smoke point, because you really want to get the pans like screaming hot so that you can get all that browning going. And so I'll put the pork chops in and I'll sort of move them around and get them browned on each side. And then I'll add while they're cooking, I will chop up an onion. And you don't have to get too fussy about it. It can be like a medium dice. If you really want it to be like a little, you could cut it smaller if you wish. So you take four of these really thin bone-in pork chops, and you get your Dutch oven screaming hot, and you add your oil and you start to brown them. And then once they've browned on one side, you turn them over and continue browning the second side, but you can start to add onions. So like a roughly chopped
Oh.
onion or a couple of onions if you like it to be a little bit more oniony. But there's a really important tip here that my friend Roxanne taught me, which is that you don't add salt. You're not adding flour to the pork chops, and you're not adding salt. It's just oil and the pork chop. And I think the salt piece is really interesting because once you add those onions, they start to sweat if they have salt on them. But in this
Oh.
case, they really brown in the same way that the pork chops do. So you watch the edges of the onions kind of they start to get brown, and then they get golden. And really, because you're using these really thin cuts of meat, the pork chop is cooking while you're browning it. It's going to be done like within the amount of time that you're browning them, but the braising part is what makes them fall off the bone. So
Oh, and
after
also
you're
because 'cause you're like it's a totally different cut of meat, and it's a thinner cut of meat, and it's not a meat that requires 4 hours like a giant tough piece of beef would. It's that the braise now is part of the texture and the flavor of the dish.
Exactly, and
Huh.
the bone when you braise it adds so much flavor to that sauce, this gravy that you're building up. So once the pork chops are browned on both sides and your onions are very golden, that's when you can add your liquid. And, she learned this dish from her grandmother. She grew up in like rural Louisiana. So, like, they would generally just use water. But you can also, my friend said you can add broth to it. I agree, it adds so much more richness. So, I usually add broth. And then you start to scrape up the onions, and at this point, you can also take the pork chops out if you wanna just kind of, like, scrape up the onions, scrape up all the browns pieces, and then you start to reduce this liquid, and this is where you can add the salt too, but you don't wanna add too much because you're reducing it to, like, a gravy. And once you kind of get it to a place that that's thick but not too thick, you add your pork chops back in, to use your description, which I thought was so beautiful, you nestle them in. You really want the majority of the meat and the bone to be submerged in water. And this is when you can either leave them on your stovetop covered and simmer them for a good 30 to 45 minutes to an hour longer until they're really falling off the bone, or you can put them in the oven and bake them at a lower temperature. My friend Roxanne also likes to, at this point, transfer them into a crock pot, especially if she's going to serve them like later in the day. And so it's this, back to like the reality, which is that the thin pork chop is already cooked, but you really want this time 30 minutes, 45 minutes, even an hour to really cook that meat until it's falling off the bone.
It's so interesting because it's really not as long as a typical braise, and it that which makes it kind of fun. If you eat pork and you love pork chops, this feels like a really accessible and easy starting point, and that you just have to make a simple pot of rice to go with it makes so much sense to me. I knew you would have, like, a counterpoint to my sort of lengthy brisket, and it
Well
Oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead. The other thing that I just also wanted to add is, like, she really gave me the most basic recipe, but she also added that, like, if she has celery, she'll add that in. Her husband also grew up in Louisiana. He himself is a very accomplished cook, and he likes to use the Trinity, which is onions, celery, and green peppers, and he often, if he has them, adds mushrooms. I tend to
Oh.
like George's recipe a little bit better. I like all that other flavor. And when you serve this, another suggestion that her grandmother made is that it really needs something cold and crunchy to go with it. So you serve this like rich, warm cooked dish with like a bowl of crudité. Like if it's, the spring or the summer, she'll serve, cherry tomatoes and carrots and celery and peppers and a fresh salad is a nice thing that goes with this too.
I think that's a good rule for most stewy braised dishes. So, Carrie, that reminds me too that there's obviously braises that don't involve beef or lamb or these sort of longer cooking meats. And I also think about chicken. And years ago, I had to develop a coq au vin recipe for a series about wine, like dishes you make with wine. Have you ever made coq au vin?
I have not, and I'm excited for you to talk about it. I feel like it's one of those sort of I don't know, in some ways it makes me think it's like a super chefy dish that I've
Right.
never done before, and so I love that you're bringing that to the table today.
So coq au vin is a French classic dish. It refers to usually an old chicken or like I forget what it's called, like not a rooster, but something like that, like a tougher bird.
The
And
capon, right?
capon, thank you.
Yes,
I knew I
yes.
was like missing the word. That's cooked in wine. And the idea is because it's an older bird, you braise it so that it becomes tender as opposed to just your simple roast chicken. Now, most people don't have access to these kinds of birds or chickens anymore. So most times coq au vin is made with just a regular grocery store chicken. And the idea is the same though. It's a braise instead of a roast. So it's going to give you something very tender, very soft. So it also typically, in addition to wine, has mushrooms. And that adds a real specific and unique flavor to coq au vin. And there's like the more traditional way to do it, and then there's an easier way to do it. And I'm going to link both recipes. But the classic method is you dredge the chicken in flour, which that will help thicken your sauce. You're doing it more for the sauce that's created with the liquid than for the meat itself. It doesn't do that much for the actual meat because the meat gets tender and soft and liquid. So you brown that chicken that's dusted with flour. You set it aside once it's browned. You throw in your onions, carrot, celery, garlic, whatever things you're using. You saute that in the drippings of the chicken, and then you add your tomato paste. You typically will add some kind of tomato as well, wine, herbs, things like thyme work really nicely in this recipe. And then you put that chicken back into the pot again. You want to fit it all in a single layer. It's typically done with like a cut up bird as opposed to like a whole. chicken that you're just sticking into the pot.
But you're still using the white meat and the dark meat,
White meat
correct?
and the
Okay.
dark meat. Like, I
Okay.
usually I've for this, I've done, like, a cut up bird. Like,
Right. Like
you
an
can
8-piece
buy those.
chicken,
Yeah, you
yeah.
can buy those pre-cut up, or you can do it yourself. And then, same idea, you either put a lid on it and simmer it, or you stick it in the oven. My preferred way for adding the mushrooms is to cook them separately and then add them into the pot later, but some people add them from the beginning. But I think they just, like, taste better and actually are more flavorful if you keep them separate for most of the braising time. So then while your chicken is braising, you get a big pan out, you sauté a bunch of mushrooms, maybe with some garlic, sherry vinegar. This is not complicated cooking. Like, this is why it's, like, less about the specific amounts of the recipe and more about the techniques. This is cooking cut up chicken with vegetables and wine. And then it's served over, mashed potatoes or with a crusty baguette. This is sort of like
It's like
homey.
country food.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, it's
country
like French
food.
peasant food, exactly. Okay, I have a very silly question, which is coq au vin usually use red wine or white wine, or you can use either?
I don't think that's a silly question. Most traditionally is red wine is
It's red
used.
wine.
And the
Okay,
same is true for brisket as well. And
right.
there's probably some logic or reason behind that besides, just the flavor. Maybe there's something the way it cooks. I know white wine is so good with seafood, like with mussels or clams, but yeah,
Or it was just what people had laying around,
probably
in the
what I have
winter
laying
when there
around.
was just like a tired old chicken in the yard and they were, they're looking for ways to make something that really isn't starting off delicious, make it delicious, And like
Yeah.
I love your tips about, just like none of this is about the technique. It's not about really the amounts. Like if you have a bunch of mushrooms, even if they're just like regular
Oh,
grocery
it's
store
regular
mushrooms. Yeah.
cremini or button, and
Yeah.
but I will say the wine you use in braising, whether it's a brisket, a short rib, a chicken, should be wine that you will
Would drink
drink.
yourself, yes.
Yes,
Yeah, I
this
think that's a
isn't
good
to
tip.
me the place for, like, an old sour bottle of wine, although that does work. It just tastes much better if it's a decent wine. Not your most expensive, but that you could actually take a glass of it and enjoy it.
Well, because 'cause you're also concentrating it too.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I will say I also have a chicken recipe that I haven't made, but when I was doing some research on this, I found this recipe by Eric Kim. It's a recipe that went through the New York Times, but it's chicken with like 20 cloves of garlic. And to me, this is kind of like a beginner's like exploration of braising, especially as someone who didn't grow up like browning meat and braising it this way. I think this is a great place to start because really what it does is it uses bone-in, skin-on chicken thighs, and you brown them on either side, and you add all this garlic. And he offers this great tip of like, a lot of the international grocery stores, like the Korean markets, like H Mart, you can get like whole garlic cloves. You don't have to peel them all. Although I will say, I read a lot of the comments, and there were some people that were like, "What's the difference? Just peel the garlic. It's not a big deal."
Well,
And
there's some political reason to it, like, I've heard, like, the ethics of how peeled garlic is produced is a little bit, like, yeah, is that we should avoid buying peeled garlic, but I also don't. I just think people should do what feels best to them and what works for them in the kitchen, so, I'm of 2 minds. I personally don't mind peeling a bunch of garlic.
I don't mind peeling garlic either. So, you throw the garlic in, you cook it a little bit, you add some white wine, and you braise it. And this recipe is similar to my pork chop recipe in that, in like 30 minutes, the chicken is done. And a lot of the comments were like, the chicken will be done in 30 minutes. You can eat it then. But if you wait the extra 15 minutes, it really does melt off the bone and
Mm.
it yields this like sauce. It's this like gravy that you can, if you want to take your chicken out and boil it down and thicken it a little bit more, if you want to add water and make it more of a brothy experience, you can do that. And so, people are really using this recipe like you just suggested. You can use it, you can serve it over mashed potatoes, you can serve it with a baguette, you can serve it over rice, like using it for what they need. But we're basically just talking about chicken, garlic, and white wine.
And it can be done on the stovetop, which I really
Yeah.
like. It doesn't have to be a whole oven production. It can just be put a lid on it, let it simmer. That's a nice thing about braising chicken. And it's truly like as simple as some garlic and some broth and some browned meat, and you have a braise, and it will
Exactly.
infuse that chicken with those flavors. That's
Yeah,
a great easy tip.
and I would say, like, as a home cook, like, it's a great place to then say, like, make it a couple of times as it's written, and then say, like, "Oh, well, I would also like mushrooms in mine," or "I'd also like parsley on top of mine," or, "I like it with rice instead of mashed potatoes." I think it's one of those, like, very cornerstone recipes that can really lead to so many more different dishes.
Yeah, and as timing would have it, as we were sort of talking about this episode, I saw this great video that the Amateur Gourmet posted about another very similar braised chicken dish. So we'll link that too, because
Great.
that's on the New York Times, and so that can be accessible. And it's the same similar idea, just slightly different, and flavor profiles, but still garlic and liquid and chicken that you brown. It's so similar. So these are great starting points if you've never made a braise.
Do you have do you sorry, 36, 35. Do we have you have one more, don't you?
Yeah, I feel like I can talk about it really. I feel like we should talk about the next 2, and if we have a slightly longer episode, but I'm gonna do it, like, in 2 minutes. I wanna be,
Okay.
like, so
Okay.
short.
Great.
Carrie, I think if we're talking about braises, we have to mention short rib, which is truly one of my favorite cuts and one of my favorite things to braise, and it's really my special occasion dish. It's actually what I make for Passover these days, and I love to make a short rib the way I make a brisket with the same kind of flavor profiles, but I've also loved, like, experimenting with different kinds of short rib recipes, and I have to shout out, Samin Nostrat's soy braised short ribs, which she included in her Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat series. It was on that Netflix show, and it's just such a phenomenal recipe. And many of our listeners may be familiar with it, but there's a little. The thing about Simi Nostra is she offers really phenomenal technique. She comes from Chez Panisse, she comes from cooking at the highest level, and she has such a deep understanding. So some of her tips include that she creates a marinade with soy sauce, brown sugar, mirin, ginger, like a kind of traditional Asian marinade. And she marinades those short ribs overnight.
Oh,
And
wow.
so they really get a lot of flavor before they even go into a cooking liquid. And then she also, like, she says to have them come to room temp for several hours. Like, she really gives them a long time at room temp. And then what she also has that's different than what we've talked about, she starts her oven off really hot at 400. So when the short ribs first go in, they're actually starting at a very hot temperature. And then later she braises them at a 325-degree temperature. And she, at the very end, raises the temperature back up and sort of cranks the oven to 450, brushes the ribs with the braising liquid, and then lets it get all shiny for about 12 minutes before it's served. And these are just like extra little steps
Wow.
that make it so really truly chefy. We'll link that recipe too, but it's a really fun way to make a short rib. If you're kind of a more ambitious cook, if you really like a cooking project, I think this is an amazing recipe to go with.
Well, I love that suggestion. I love a short rib too. That's one of my go-to, like, New Year's, Christmas, like, dishes that I love to make in the winter. But I've never tried this one. So I really do love that suggestion because it's just actually taking a couple of extra steps. Like, it's not hard to take the lid off and crank up the heat and give it another 10 minutes to make it
No.
glossy and beautiful. But I have one last recipe that I want to offer us, and it's in the completely opposite direction. It is a braised squash in ginger beer. And this is a recipe I've had on my radar for a while. I haven't yet made. And you could really use it with a kabocha or a butternut or, really any hard winter squash that you have. And this is also one of those, like, a much quicker braise. You can do it on the stovetop. And what you're doing is you're just taking ginger beer. And by ginger beer, I mean, like, the spicier version of ginger ale. I think if you had ginger ale, you could add, some fresh ginger to it. But, like, one of the ones that you would use for like a Moscow Mule or for, mixing
Like
your drinks.
a non-alcoholic,
A
yeah.
non-alcoholic ginger beer, and you put that in a shallow pan that has a lid on it, and you're adding a little bit of butter and some cloves if you wish,
Ooh.
and you the recipe suggests that you cut the squash into like jewel-like pieces, and there are a lot of comments that were like, "What does that
What does that
mean?"
mean? Yeah.
And I asked myself the same, but then I also looked at the picture, and I would say that the jewel-like pieces are almost like those baby carrots, like kind of like a bigger bite-sized piece.
Huh.
Like you're kind of cutting it into like, sort of like a long rectangle that's also still thick so that you want it to be cooked through, but you don't want it to be falling apart.
Not
And
like
so
wedges, like not I would think of long wedges.
I would think of long wedges too, but this is more of like a rectangle shaped
Huh,
piece, like
weird.
a baby
Okay.
carrot, so chopped
Okay.
it up like that. And then you're just cooking the squash in this flavorful, spicy ginger liquid that has a little bit of fat in it. You can add some cloves if you wish. And you're really reducing the liquid down so it becomes syrupy. Oh, and there's a little bit of honey too. You can add honey, although I don't know that I would add honey. I might add like I like things more a little more savory, so I would add a pinch of red pepper flakes. And then
Mm.
once your squash is cooked through and your liquid is reduced down, the suggestion is to serve it with a gremolata, which is fresh herbs, some parsley, some fresh garlic, you're sort of sprinkling it on top, salt and pepper. And it's that same idea that you have this long cooked item, this long cooked squash, and then you're adding something really fresh to it. And because I also like fresh mint I like fresh mint with my kabocha squash. I would add fresh mint and parsley into mine too.
That sounds so good. I love that you added vegetables because they're forgotten often with braises. And as you remember, like one of my favorite dishes of like 2022 were braised
Braised
leeks.
leeks. That's right.
We'll add that recipe too because
Yes.
braised leeks are so good, and in the winter, there's so many leeks, but it's the same thing for any of these things, right? It's pick a great ingredient, pick a cooking liquid that you like, whether it's a ginger beer, a beer, a wine, a stock, and then let something cook low and slow until it's tender and make sort of a sauce with that liquid. It's the same principle for everything.
Yeah, I really love that. I hope our listeners make a couple of these recipes. I'm going to make that squash recipe and report back and let you know because I feel like this is something you would love to.
Yes, I definitely want you to make it and be the test subject. Thank you for doing that.
Of course. Well, this has been really fun. Until next time.
Till next time. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for being our food friend.
If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with friends. We love hearing from you, so follow us on Instagram or drop us a line at foodfriendspodcast.com.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you and your food friends. Happy cooking and eating.